Hello, my pals. Who will be first to tune in live? And who's tuning in later? We love it when you hit that love button, the share button, the like button, but especially when you comment and tell us where you're tuning in from, or what you're thinking about today, or just a greeting. But it's so important when you comment, and it just signals to the Facebook algorithm that we're doing something of value as we're lighting up the darkness. So let's see those comments and shares and likes and signal to Facebook that we're doing something of value so more people have a chance to learn with our community. All right, who's in the house? What cities are in the house? What continents are in the house? James Roth. First one in, Indianapolis. Great to see you, my holy brother. Who else is in the house? Dennis Rapport from Maryland. Welcome, Dennis. Great to have you here. We have a really colorful page today from the Talmud. We've been looking at some real nitty-gritty particulars about how, when, and where we are permitted to pray, we're obligated to pray. And these rules, they're just so particularized and so, like I say, into the nitty-gritty of human life. And that's what our sages do. They look into every nook and cranny of human life to see what is the right way according to God's will. Missy Eichner from Allentown, Florida. Welcome. Stephanie Frieden from Herndon, Virginia. Sandy from Michigan. So great to have you in our virtual Beis Midrash, our virtual classroom. Great to be learning. That's it. Hit that thumb, that like button, all these kinds of actions, right? Reactions, whether it's the like, the love, commenting especially is good, telling us where you're tuning in from. Very valuable, so that the algorithm reads we're doing something of value and more people get a chance to see it. Cheryl Stack says another Hoosier in the house. Love it. Welcome all Hoosiers. All right, we are, hello Robin from Ohio. We are in the first volume of the Talmud in our daily cycle, the Daf Yomi cycle. And we are coming to the end of chapter 3. We have been studying the timing requirements of saying the daily Shema, also what to do if we're interrupted. And in this third chapter, we've been looking at what to do if there are conditions that impact our ability to achieve a state of holiness as we pray, like being in the presence of a dead body or of nakedness or of filth. And we're actually going to talk a little bit more about what constitutes filth and how we deal with that today. And then tomorrow, right at the beginning of tomorrow, we'll wrap up this chapter, chapter 3. With God's help, we'll be here tomorrow. And then we'll move into chapter 4, which is going to be more concerned with the prayer, meaning the Amidah, also known as the Shemona Esrei, the 18 blessings that our sages instituted as the 3 times a day prayer. So let's wrap up or come close to the end of this section on impediments to reciting the daily Shema, and of course the digressions that come along. By now, if you've been tracking our daily class, you see that the sages stay on a subject, but very often, because one sage has given an opinion, we go explore a different opinion of that same person, or because they're talking about a particular subject, we receive some other opinions on that subject, even though, it becomes tangential to the original Mishnah that we are studying. Generally speaking, the way the Talmud is organized is we have a Mishnah. This is the oral teachings compiled around the year 200. And then we go into the discussion of that Mishnah known as the Gemara. And these are the oral teachings that were compiled about 400 years later and became the Mishnah plus the Gemara equals the Talmud. But of course, we also have many commentaries on the commentaries that came over the centuries since. In all things, we are clarifying God's will in our lives. How is God's will revealed in our lives? Through the Torah. It's just the Torah is a very short document. The 5 books of Moses, as a law book, is actually very short. And so there are many questions left unanswered if it's a document that we want to practically live our lives by. And that is what we're doing each day. So, we've been discussing reciting the Shema in the presence of nakedness or of filth, like excrement and related matters. And now we're going to continue with that. So at the beginning of our page, and we're doing Berachos 25. So this is page 25 in Tractate Berachos. So at the beginning of this page, we learn that as we discussed yesterday, one's private parts, the genitals, need to be covered if one is going to recite the Shema. We learned that in the context of going to bed. And so even though a person might choose to sleep, in their birthday suit, for the purpose of reciting the Shema, their private parts do need to be covered. And that's a general rule. Your private parts need to be covered, even for the morning Shema. But one could recite the Shema with their upper body uncovered. Certainly a man is not, there's no sexual organs, right, in the upper body above the waist. However, for reciting the prayer, the Amidah, he has to have his upper body covered as well. What is the reason? When one recites the Shema, one is actually talking about God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That's the Shema, right? And then you shall love the Lord your God, etc. And if you will love the Lord your God, good things will happen, and you are commanded to, all the things that you have to do, put on tefillin, wear tzitzis, the fringes, the phylacteries. But we're talking about God. When we pray the 18 blessings, right, then we address the God of our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God who blesses us every day, and we thank God, and we bless God, and we're speaking to God directly, right? And we want to be speaking to God directly from the heart. And for that reason, we're modest about the heart, and we cover the heart. So the heart has to be covered, the body has to be covered when we're praying, because that's considered a state of more modesty and more focus. Like the heart is uncovered, it's going to be less focused. Next issue that comes up is, we've already discussed a little bit, that we don't wear ritual objects like the fringes, like the prayer shawl, like the tefillin, the black straps and the boxes with the scrolls of parchment in them. We don't wear those in the bathroom, nor do we bring books of scripture with us in the bathroom. We don't do Torah study. We don't think about holy matters when we're in the bathroom. But what happens if a person goes to the bathroom, perhaps he's in a hurry, and when he's already in the bathroom and involved in doing his thing in the bathroom, realizes that his tefillin are still on him, right? It's a very practical type of matter that could come up. On the one hand, you think, I made a mistake. I got to get out of here as soon as possible because my tefillin should not be in the bathroom. But our sages are very mindful of health and health-related matters. And, if you're engaged in going to the bathroom and suddenly you want to cut that off sharply, quickly, so that could hurt you, right? I mean, if you need to go to the bathroom and you even start to go to the bathroom and then you just stop, or you're going to restrain yourself. We've already learned in the last couple of days that if you have an urge to go, whether it's number one or number two, so you don't start your prayers. You need to go to the bathroom and deal with that, and then you can come back, because you shouldn't be in a state of prayer, in a state of connecting with the divine, and be distracted, by the need to go. So now if you find yourself in the bathroom and you're in that situation, our sages offer a very practical teaching, right? So you go, you do your thing, and what they say is, so when the first mass, the primary mass of the solid waste comes out of you, okay, so now the urge is greatly diminished. You might still have more to do, but the urge is much less now, so you can stop, go outside, fold up your tefillin, put them in a safe place, or wrap them up very well wrapped if you have to bring them back in with you, because there is no safe place to store them. We covered that as well. And then you can go back and finish your business. It's a very practical solution to a very real world problem. right? And what we see there, what's important is that sages are going to always be very careful in teaching us to guard God's honor, right? So when when we wear holy objects, when we recite blessings, when we pray, etc., it's like we're honoring God, and we give God honor through our praise. But also, the sages are going to be very careful with our health, right? And just the same principle as on the most important fast of the year, Yom Kippur, in many respects the holiest day of the year, a person who is sick and their health will be endangered by fasting is 100% exempt from fasting. And likewise here, you won't cut yourself off from going to the bathroom if that's going to hurt you. You do what you need to do, then you do what you would do in terms of leaving the bathroom, getting off the tefillin, and then you come back and finish. What if you discover that there's a piece of solid waste somewhere on your skin, right? Either human waste, or maybe you're a farmer and you get some manure on you, or you're a gardener. I mean, this could easily happen, right? So you realize that some of this is staining your skin. So the obvious answer is, okay, well, you go clean up before you go pray. I mean, you can't pray in the presence of solid waste, of fecal matter. So certainly you wouldn't want to pray if it's on your skin. But the answer is not so simple, because what if you're approaching the time of day where if you miss it, you will have missed fulfilling your obligation for that day. Right? We've already learned that there are certain time limits that you must say the Shema within those time limits, and you're approaching that limit, the deadline, and you're somewhat dirtied. Let's say you were farming, you're spreading manure on the ground, right? Fertilizer. It doesn't even necessarily smell that bad. What do you do? So in that condition, we have a disagreement between the sages. So Rav Chisda says that if there's like a little bit on your skin, but it does not smell, right? It does not smell, and you're able to cover up that part of your body where it's on your skin, then you can say the Shema. But Rav Chisda prohibits, no matter what, you can't do it. Rav Huna permits and says if you can cover it up and there's no foul odor, then okay. But the law is like Rav Chisda. If there is poop on your body, you don't pray. In all but the most exigent circumstances. So if you absolutely are not going to be able to fulfill your obligation by the deadline, it's just that close, okay, so then you can do it in accordance with the opinion of Rav Huna, but remember, only if you can cover it up and there is no odor. Right? If those conditions are not met and you can't wash in time, okay, you're not going to be able to fulfill your obligation that day. So they sort of stretch the point as far as they can to help people fulfill their obligation, but up to a certain point you can't go any further. And likewise, Rav Huna and Rav Chisda disagree, and Rav Huna is a little bit more lenient than Rav Chisda, where there is a source of a foul odor. I mean, this could be, solid waste or just anything that emits a foul odor. Can you pray in the presence of a foul odor, right? And now we're not talking about seeing a thing. We're not talking about being in the presence of a thing, but only maybe the odor, something that's causing an odor. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something as filthy as poop. It could be just something that creates that odor, right? So Rav Huna says, if you can identify what the source of that odor is, you just have to move 4 cubits away from it, and then you can recite the daily Shema. Rav Chisda is more stringent, and he says you have to move to a place where you don't smell it anymore, and then 4 cubits more. As we've seen, and then there's an interesting point. So now let's say that there's a dung heap. Okay, it is excrement. It doesn't smell anymore. You cannot recite Shema in the presence of it until you're not in its presence. But there's an exception if this thing is 10 hand breaths, and that's a tefach, a hand breath. So a hand breath is like this distance, right? The width of your hand. That's considered a tefach, and something that is 10 tefachim, right? So some people would say this is about 4 inches, so something that's 40 inches. If it's 40 inches higher than you or 40 inches lower than you, and I'm not sure where you measure from, that was unclear to me. So maybe 40 inches completely below you, below your feet, right? Or 40 inches above your head to be stringent. Maybe it's only 40 inches away from your head or your eye level, but I'm not sure. So let's say 40 inches above the top of your head or 40 inches below the bottom of your feet, considered another domain. So like you're not in its presence. Again, as long as it doesn't smell and it's not in your line of vision, then you could be exempt from dealing with it and you could recite your Shema. We also learned on this page something interesting, that you can't recite the Shema, okay, in the presence of any kind of a pile of poop, a dung heap. And this includes poop that is used for tanning, right? So that's treating leather. And I was really intrigued to learn that because, hopefully we'll study together for 7.5 years. And in our journey, many times in the Talmud, we'll encounter different professions being talked about in different ways. And sort of occasionally talk about the status of people who have different professions. The sages will put Torah scholars at the top of anything, and then nobility and powerful people and government leaders, and then wealthy people who support Torah study, etc. And often kind of at the bottom of the pile in terms of status are tanners, people who deal with hides and turn them into leather. And it's like, I always thought, why? What's so bad about that? I mean, I think people who create leather are wonderful, and I wear leather. I enjoy wearing leather. What's wrong with the people who, create leather products out of cowhides? And, in today's day and age, nothing. But thousands of years ago, they didn't have the chemicals and treatments that we have now. And what they did with cowhides is that they would soak them in urine and then in feces, often dog feces and pig feces. And now I understand a little better what the problem was with being a tanner. And there were sages who were tanners, by the way. So it was just a job that entailed working with these materials that they would require a lot of cleaning before going on to do other things in their day. But now we see that even poop that is used in this commercial process of tanning leather is still poop, and you can't pray in the presence of those materials. Then an interesting question comes up. So imagine you're going to pray. Let's say you've found a nice spot outside. This is a good place to pray. I'm going to say my daily Shema right here. And a manure truck or manure wagon, rolls by slowly. So you can't say the Shema in the presence, right, of solid waste, right, of fecal matter. What if it's moving? So this is an interesting question, and there's a dispute between the sages Abaye and Rava. Abaye permits you to say the Shema while the manure wagon is passing because it's not in the place with you, right? And interestingly, he gives the example why it's permitted of this whole other set of laws, which has to do with tuma, okay, with ritual impurity, sometimes translated as being unclean or impure. But it's very important to understand that tuma is it's a very specific kind of legal concept, and saying impure or unclean does not capture it. Because, for example, touching a Torah scroll can make you tameh, can make you impure. A woman who's just given birth, which is like the most beautiful thing, that can happen, right, in this world. I mean, it's like the holiest moment that a couple may ever enjoy is watching the birth of a new baby. But the woman who gives birth becomes tameh for a certain amount of time afterward. So this really has to do with laws that are actually not rational, not comprehensible, but which lead to purification processes, right, which get us back into a state of ritual purity, meaning we can enter the temple and offer a sacrifice. Most of these concepts are no longer applicable in the practical world because we don't have a temple. And so it's not really about being tahor or tameh, pure or impure. It's just, for example, a woman is experiencing the monthly cycle. After that's over and she's observed the 7 clean days without spotting, she will go to an immersion in the mikveh, and then she's permitted to her husband. But it's not about being tahor or tameh for entering the temple. At any rate, in the old days, we had what's now translated as leprosy, but it's not leprosy like that disease is understood now. It was a skin condition which would afflict a person because of, sometimes it would seem random, but often it was because, sometimes it's related to Lashon Hara, like they spoke in ways they shouldn't have spoken, and then they get this skin condition. Or sometimes it just visits a person and they don't know why, but they have to go through a process, it's in the ancient world, of purification. And you can contract impurity, tuma, from a person who has that skin condition. You don't get the skin condition, but you can get the impurity if you touch that person, or if you are in a room with them. That's called the impurity of the tent, meaning that you didn't touch them, but you share an enclosed space with them, so then you can contract impurity from that person. Same with a dead body. If you're like in a tent or in a room with a dead body under certain conditions, so you can contract that tuma. And if the temple were standing, you'd have to immerse yourself and go through a certain process before you can bring an offering in the temple. So Abaya is saying that if you happen to be sitting under a tree and a person with that skin condition walks under the tree, if he walks under the same tree that you're under and keeps walking, nothing happens to you. But if he stops, so now you occupy that space together, then you can contract that impurity by shared space. And so he says, so likewise, if the manure truck rolls by, then it impacts your prayer. It doesn't impact your prayer in the same way that the walking leper doesn't impart impurity to you. Rava disagrees with Abaye and says that if the manure wagon rolls by while you're attempting to say Shema, so you have to stop. You can't pray in that situation. You have to wait till it's gone, right? And his reasoning is that you cannot learn the law of praying in the presence of a moving source of poop from the law of the walking leper. Why? Because when we learn about the leper, again, not a person with leprosy the way we think of it, but having this skin condition, when we learn that law in the Torah, it says that one who has that condition will leave the camp, right? Leave where everybody else is living and make his dwelling outside the camp until the skin condition passes. So his condition is tied to his location. But poop is poop, whether it's here or there, and it remains poop. And so the distinction that, or the comparison that Abaye was making, Rava discredits. And indeed, we hold like Rava. So if you wanted to say your Shema and the manure wagon was rolling by, you need to stop, wait for it to be gone, out of sight, out of your domain, out of your presence, and then you can fulfill your obligation of reciting the daily Shema. If there's an object on the ground, could be poop, could be a chocolate donut, we're not sure. Just heard a funny comedian on SXM radio made a joke about that. But if there's an object on the ground, you don't know. Is it poop? Is it, a chocolate donut that someone threw away? You're uncertain. And you can't ascertain, you can't go up to it and touch it, or you refuse to do that for whatever reason. You're not going to examine it closely, so you're uncertain. There's uncertainty whether you're in the presence of poop or not. So you are exempt from your obligation, or let's say you are prohibited from fulfilling your obligation to recite Shema in the presence of this uncertain poop. But if there's a liquid on the ground, and you're uncertain whether it is urine or not, you do say the Shema, right? So poop and urine have different status. Why? Because in the Torah we learned that the children of Israel in the camp, when they were in the desert, there was a specific commandment. It's a Torah obligation, a biblical obligation to, if you poop outside, you have to cover it with dirt, right? You got to, in fact, one of the holy objects that the people carried with them in the desert was a shovel. Why? So they would cover the poop, right? And so poop has a different status than urine because there was no command to cover the urine. If we know that some liquid on the ground is urine, we cannot recite the Shema or pray in the presence of the urine until when? So at some point it dries, right? And there's a little bit of a dispute. As long as there's a mark on the ground, can we recite the Shema even if it's totally dry? Answer, we can recite the Shema even though there's a mark on the ground as long as it is not moist. If the mark on the ground that was urine, we know it was urine. If it's still moist, can't recite the Shema there. Once it's completely dry, we can. In ascertaining these rules, we meet a new sage that we haven't met yet in our journey, and his name is Geneva. And Geneva is kind of interesting because when later sages give a teaching in the name of Geneva, or quote Geneva quoting someone else, like Rav, because Geneva was an associate, a friend of Rav, the very famous Amora. A Tana is a rabbi, and an Amora is a rabbi in the Talmud. The Tana, or Tanaim, plural, the Tanaim were the rabbis that taught and lived up to when the Mishnah was published. So rabbis that lived before 200 in the Common Era. Rabbis after that were cited in the Talmud are called Amoraim. That's the plural of Amora. So these are just later rabbis. Geneva was an Amora. He lived and taught and learned in Babylonia and was a contemporary, like I said, of Rav, very famous Amora in his time. Geneva was well respected and also very wealthy and powerful, but he was also very contentious and got into arguments with people and sometimes was just a little bit too much, right? And alienated people. One of the people he alienated was Mar Ukva, who was the exilarch. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. That's a word I've read and not spoken. Someone can help me on this. Is it exilarch or exilarch? It's spelled Exillarch. But I think it's exilarch because it's related to patriarch. Same kind of word as patriarch. And the exilarch was the leader of the Jewish community in exile. That's why he's the exilarch. And so meaning the Jewish community in Babylonia, which was large and powerful, and there was a lot of learning going on there, and they weren't being persecuted like the Jewish community in the land of Israel in this period, which was under Roman control and really being heavily persecuted by the Romans. That is why the Mishnah and ultimately the Gemara were written down. It's because of that persecution that was going on in the land of Israel. Geneva alienated Mar Ukva, the exilarch, so much that he might have been turned over to the authorities if Mar Ukva wasn't a very patient and forgiving man who just let it go. But later, Geneva's nature was such that he ended up angering someone and was ultimately sentenced to death by the governing authorities, not the Jewish community, but by the governing authorities where he lived. But getting into that kind of trouble, and it's not spelled out here, maybe we'll find out later exactly what he did to earn himself the death penalty. But it was actions that even the Jewish disciples and later students and rabbis disapproved of. So when they would give a teaching in Geneva's name, they would say, "May God forgive him." So as our master Geneva said, "May God forgive him," etc., etc., etc. Making a distinction between the teachings of a person and the example that he set with his life. And we'll find that again later. There was a guy, a sage, who went really bad, and they wouldn't even write his name generally. He came to be known as Acher, or other, like the other one. So they wouldn't even say his name because he worked with the enemies of the Jews to persecute Jews. He really went bad. And yet there were certain teachings that he gave over when he was young, which are valid teachings. And so they would distinguish between the man's teaching, and his behavior. Right? Generally, that's not necessary because our sages are really holy, tzaddikim, righteous people, often living quite saintly lives. But in cases like this, they make the distinction. And then the last point that we make here, just two little points, is because this refers back to the Mishnah that we've been discussing. We know that you can't recite the Shema when you're naked. You need to cover yourself up, right? So what if you find yourself in a place where you have no clothing to cover yourself up with? Like, for example, you're in a hot tub, whatever. You went in the hot tub, you're out in the nice hot tub, and you realize, oh man, I didn't say Shema, and it's getting to that point of time where I need to say Shema. And it's so late that you can't pop out of the hot tub, which you happen to be naked, and get dressed, right? So you're naked in the hot tub. Can you say Shema? Interesting answer. If you can see your nakedness, you cannot recite the Shema while you're in the water. But if the water is murky, you can recite the Shema. If the water is foul, you cannot recite. You can't use foul water to cover your nakedness, but you can use murky water, right? It can be a little muddy. It just can't be like, a smelly algae pond. So I wonder if it would qualify, like if you're in a hot tub that has, bubbles, so you can't see what's going on underneath the surface, probably that would qualify to hide your nakedness from your eyes, and then you could fulfill your obligation to recite Shema. And finally, there's a discussion of the chamber pot. So much of what we've been talking about is the bathroom, or in their case back then, sort of the place, out in the field where people would go to do their business. But wealthy people who would have larger homes and multiple rooms might have chamber pots, right? So chamber pot, you get it. You probably know what a chamber pot is. They were still in use, up until the age of modern plumbing. So certainly 200 years ago, people had chamber pots, and probably more recently than that. And that would just be a pot that would be in the house, and you would do your business in the chamber pot. And then, maybe in the morning when it's safe to go outside and there's not thieves and robbers in the dark and it's not so cold, you could go and empty the chamber pot. So now you have a chamber pot in the house. Can you recite the Shema in the presence of the chamber pot? Answer, no. Even if there's not stuff in it, you don't recite in the presence of the chamber pot. You got to get the chamber pot out of your sight. Put it under the bed, behind the bed, but you can't be in view of the chamber pot. And from that, we learn rules like we don't do things in the bathroom if it's a bathroom and there's a toilet visible, right? Some rooms it's like unclear. Is it a bathroom? Is it a powder room, etc.? So if there's a toilet visible, so then it's like a bathroom, and we can fulfill our obligation in such a room. Tomorrow, with God's help, we'll get together again, and we'll very quickly complete chapter 3. There's only very little left. And then in the next page 26, we'll be starting chapter 4 of Berachos. And now we're going to change our focus from the conditions under which we can pray or not pray, what do we do if we're interrupted, what do we do in the presence of filth or nakedness, etc. We're going to get more into what is the prayer, the Amidah, what are the 18 blessings, how did they come to be chosen, how did that whole body of prayer, which is so much, it's the centerpiece. We say the Shema twice a day, but it's really the Amidah that is the centerpiece of the morning, afternoon, and evening prayer. We say it 5 times a day if we are praying with a minyan, because when we go to services, we'll say it silently, and then it'll be repeated by the chazan, the prayer leader. In the afternoon again, we'll say it silently, and then the prayer leader will repeat it. And in the evening, it's only said silently. So it's such an important set of prayers, those 18 blessings. How do they take shape? We're going to start learning that tomorrow. All right, my friends. Let me just take a look if there are any questions. If you got something, I'm going to just scroll up through the comments quickly, see if there's anything pressing. And otherwise, let's see. Katie O'Neill says, so does all of this apply if you are feeling sick and maybe you ate something for lunch that did not agree with you and you had a rather violent reaction, shall we say? Like you're upchucking, right? That's what it sounds like. Or if it okay, if you have a violent reaction to food that you ate and it went through you and is really causing problems. If you're being distracted by your physical condition, like you really need to go and keep going, so that's just going to interrupt. I mean, you're not going to be able to have that focus and mindset and be free from that distraction under such a condition. So, I'm not a rabbi. You should check with a rabbi on all these questions. But it seems to me like if that's what's going on, you're going to be excused. It would have to be, because you don't know when you're going to have to run back to the bathroom, right? That's the issue. But I think what you'd be looking for there is like your best effort to handle the situation. So if like you keep having to run to the bathroom over and over, okay, you can't do it. But maybe if you achieve like, okay, I know I'm going to be good for 10 minutes. What can I recite in 5 minutes that I'm going to be able to safely get through, go to the most critical parts of the prayer and do that, right? So you're always looking for what you can do. But I think intent is so important, and the desire, think about what we've been talking about, right? Like these particularities of filth and defining filth and distance from filth and what we do in the presence of it and how we deal with it. Why? Why are we having such intricate discussion about such vile things? And the answer is because our intent is to love God with all our heart and soul and resources, right? And under difficult conditions where we're going to be careful not to dishonor God or cause, do something gross in the presence of the king. We wouldn't do that in the presence of an earthly king, so certainly we wouldn't do that in the presence of the King of Kings. The intent behind all of this kind of study, right, is to love God with all our hearts and to do the best that we can. And so that means not only knowing the rules, but hopefully getting to a state when we're praying of really connecting with Him. Not just reciting all these words and, okay, I got through it. But, at least once, every time we stop to pray, we have to have at least one real authentic moment of connecting with God and being truly grateful, sincerely grateful, or sincerely petitioning, or just be getting real, right? We want to get real with God, and we're trying to create conditions for that. Marcus Tempe says, can you ever start over? I assume you're asking, start over your prayer. There's a lot of rules for that, so I would recommend just looking at the prayer book about what happens when we're interrupted. If you're saying that we even covered it a few days ago, what happens if you sort of get to the end of the prayer and you realize that you spaced out in the middle and you're not even sure if you said it correctly. And so then you do start over, but the question is, how far back do you go to start over? Is it sort of the next paragraph break or the closest place where you know you completed it properly and then go back to there and continue from there? The limitations on this are, why not just start over, But if you actually said a prayer and fulfilled your obligation, you don't repeat that again if you did it correctly, because, then you might be uttering a blessing in vain. And we really avoid doing that. So sometimes, I once had a Taekwondo teacher, Master Dvorsky. Everyone, shout out to Master Dvorsky, if anyone knows him. I just ran into his rabbi the other day. I really got to reach out to Master Dvorsky. And Master Dvorsky once taught us that, you really try to do your best every day. This is in martial arts practice. And sometimes you want to really succeed, like there's a move you're trying to do and you just can't execute, and you try and you just can't get it. And some people might be inclined to, I'm just going to stay here and do it until I get it. But he taught us that sometimes you just take the failure home. Sometimes you just go home with the failure, you live with it, and it's going to strengthen you and teach you, and the next time you come back, you'll be able to do it. So sometimes we don't achieve the state we want to achieve in prayer, and it might not be appropriate to just do the whole thing over, but rather say, I didn't do it right. I didn't get where I wanted to go. I took it for granted. I just sped through it. But live with that, absorb that, and then maybe, if it's nighttime, so then the next morning in morning prayers, you'll bring that with you and you'll achieve, a better, more, a state of greater connection the next time. If you were interrupted by an accident is what I meant. Respect to God above all. Yeah. I mean, yeah, so like I said, you go back to the place that it makes sense to go back to. All right. My pals, sending you lots of love from the West Coast of the United States. And oh man, I got to go and get to afternoon prayers. Sending you all lots of love. Mwah.